Alright guys, this is an animation of basically the bones for a pterodactyl type character that I'm creating for my new game. I'll talk about the game at some point, but at the moment, because it's such early stages, I won't get into it. Um, Now, first of all, before we get started, this tutorial is going to be a breakdown on how I create this animation. But before we get into it, I want to just point out a few arguments on why using the biped system, which is basically a skeletal system, like a rigging type system, and why I feel it's appropriate for animation for small game development. Now, this is just a pipeline that I would suggest. The reason why I feel the biped is um, suited for small game development as opposed to using Maya or Blender is I feel that Maya and Blender, I feel that the difficulty level for setting up rigs is quite hard. Now, it's kind of, and you've got to remember, a lot of these big studios who use Maya and Blender, well, not Blender really, 'cause a lot of big studios don't really use Blender that much, but a lot of big studios who use Maya, they would have a separate rigging team, or they'd have the bigger studios, they'd have a bigger team, and they'd have literally employ someone who just rigs the characters, and then the animators go and do it. So if you're a small team, the whole point is time. Time is the most important commodity, obviously. So the less time you have to spend rigging, you can be creating your mod. Because obviously most animators in a small team, you got to do everything. You got to do your modeling, you got to do your animation, you got to do all the art, and if you're a small one man team, you've got to do the programming as well. That's a lot of things to juggle, and and if you use 3ds Max, at least one of the types of the pipeline can be streamlined. That's why I strongly believe, as a small game development company, you should really consider in your pipeline just using 3ds Max only for the animation. For the animation side of things. You could still use Blender and ZBrush, etc., for your modeling of your characters and stuff. Anyway, so that's that over with. Let's deal with the breakdown of the animation. So, if you followed along with any of my other tutorials, you'd realize that the first step is you need your reference. So I'm gonna show the reference material which I use for this character. Obviously, I modified it slightly, but then you get a rough drift of how you do it. And then the second step that you do when you're creating an animation is you block out. If you follow my tutorials as well, my earlier animation tutorials, you notice the first thing to do is I block out the animation. So let's just show you about how I block it out. Now, even if you're using Blender or Maya, you don't need to click off straight away because it's 3ds Max and you're so disgusted with 3ds Max. Some of the principles I use for blocking out animation and doing the keyframes can be the principles can be used in those programs in Maya and Blender by doing, and I'll show you how. I will explain. I won't show you, but I'll explain how you could do it. Right. So let's look at an early iteration of this animation. So if you look at this animation, the way I've set up the rig, etc., I first blocked out the animation. Now when it comes to setting up the rig, I would suggest you if you're unsure how I created this, if you check out my biped rig setup, that will give you an idea of the principles I use to scale stuff and copy frames copy the skeleton across, etc., and how you can scale and position parts of your skeleton. So I won't show that in this animation. I mean in this tutorial. But as I say, you can just check out the biped setup, how to set up a biped and how to transform it so it looks like the character that you're actually making yourself. So right, if you look at this rig and it's blocking out, if you look at it, I've only got 10 frames. So you obviously got your up, it's going down, let's bring it back up. And if you notice, the body actually does move as well. So on the downward thrust, he rises up, and then when he's bringing the wings back up, he lowers down. So you've got to remember that in your anime. That's an important thing, so that it's not a static movement. Also, the head. I did a little bit of reference, even though I use this tutorial. I mean this as a reference. These images as a reference for the actual animation. I did look at a goose flying, because I wanted to just kind of work out, because a goose kind of similar to a dragon in some respects. It's got that long neck, and obviously I wanted to have a look at the way that the gooses fly. So it's important to sometimes don't just guess it. Do a little bit of the homework. Do your homework. Have a little bit. You don't have to spend ages doing it, but that's what YouTube's there for. I just typed in goose and found it. So have a look at, if you're doing a dragon or something like that, have a look at study the way dragons fly, etc. And even bats even. But anyway, so what I found with the goose is the heads were kind of quiet. They stay in kind of one place. So if we look at that and we go through it, head kind of still kind of stay, even though it moves a little bit, it's kind of still quiet in one place. So once I've got the keyframes done, the rough keyframes done, and I was kind of relatively happy. If you follow my tutorials, what I then do is, if you notice it from my other tutorials, is I rescale the frames. So what you do, you go to this key. If you're using 3ds Max, that is, you would go to this key here and make sure it's on frames, and then 1 to 10, and then you just go rescale time, and then what you try and do is keep it even to what the number of frames it is. So 1 to 10, and if I got 30, rescale key to whole frames, and then OK. And even though this isn't perfect, it'll give you that rough movement that you want, and then obviously you have to refine it. Obviously this wasn't perfect, so I had to muck about with it and refine it to get that smooth finish that I wanted. Also the towel wasn't great, so I had to do a bit of tweaking on that. That's more of like a secondary animation. So by doing it this way, I find you do your keys and you do your block out frames first, and then you do your refining afterwards when you rescale the frame. It definitely will streamline your animation process when you get nice keyframes done, and then you can refine it to get the rest of the animation right. So what I did, if we go back to my finished animation, if you can see it, obviously the towel, that was like more of a secondary animation. So I kind of made the towel kind of wave. You got nice flowing movement. So based on the pelvis upward thrust, that dictated how the towel moves. And the other thing I try to do is just do a little bit of subtle movement in the in the claws. I did find it a little bit tricky to get that sorted out. I don't know why that became a problem, but with the biped setup, it wasn't like just a nice simple thing. It took a little while to get sorted out. But eventually I kind of came up with this, and I was relatively happy with that. Now, obviously, um, the I've got to skin this, and this is the character that I'm gonna be. It's not. This is not total the game ready character. Um, I'm gonna do a slightly lower polygon version of it. Well, I've done it already actually, but and that's the character that's gonna be rigged inside it. So this is the skeleton. Now, if you, even though on the biped setup that I've shown how to set up a biped, excuse me, I didn't really go through uh, an in-depth of how I set up the skeleton for this. If you guys, if I get, two or three even, because my channel's not that big, but two or three people who go, you know what, could you just show me how you set up this dragon? I will consider doing a video on just how I set up the dragon or pterodactyl. Um, but again, like I said, even though I'm using 3ds Max, the principle, if you take anything away from this, even if you're using Blender or Maya, remember to block out your animations and then rescale it after, and then you could do your fine tuning of your animation. I see so many tutorials online where people are spending too much time doing like a simple cycle, and they're doing a cycle using say 150 frames when they should be using a cycle doing 10 frames. Get the key blocking out of your frames done, and then rescale it after. If you think about it, what traditional animators used to do, Disney guys, whatever, you'd have your key animator, he'd be the guy in charge, the boss guy in charge, and he'd do your key animation frames. And then this is in a studio, and then they would have the apprentice, and he would do your in betweens. Technically, what we are doing is we're using the in between. We're using the computer as our in between guy. So try and remember that. Use the computer as your in between guy, as opposed to trying to do your in betweens while as you're doing your keyframes as well. Right, I think that's it now. So, as per usual, remember, don't be a slave to the algorithm. I'm out. Laters.